Part 2 of an episode of Fiddletown, from Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. An episode of Fiddletown, Part 2. Athwart the long, low-studded attic, a slant sunbeam from a single small window lay, filled with dancing motes, and only half illuminating the barren, dreary apartment. In the ray of this sunbeam she saw the child's glowing hair as if crowned by a red aureole, as she sat upon the floor with her exaggerated doll between her knees. She appeared to be talking to it, and it was not long before Mrs. Tretherick observed that she was rehearsing the interview of a half-hour before. She catechized the doll severely, cross-examining it in regard to the duration of its stay there, and generally on the measure of time. The imitation of Mrs. Tretherick's manner was exceedingly successful, and the conversation almost a literal reproduction, with a single exception. After she had informed the doll that she was not her mother, at the close of the interview she added pathetically that if she was dead, very dead, she might be her mamma, and love her very much. I have already hinted that Mrs. Tretherick was deficient in a sense of humor. Perhaps it was for this reason that this whole scene affected her most unpleasantly, and the conclusion sent the blood tingling to her cheek. There was something, too, inconceivably lonely in the situation. The unfurnished vacant room, the half-lights, the monstrous doll, whose very size seemed to give a pathetic significance to its speechlessness, the smallness of the one animate, self-centered figure, all these touched more or less deeply the half-poetic sensibilities of the woman. She could not help utilizing the impression as she stood there, and thought what a fine poem might be constructed from this material if the room were a little darker, the child lonelier, say, sitting beside a dead mother's bier, and the wind wailing in the turrets. And then she suddenly heard footsteps at the door below and recognized the tread of the colonel's cane. She flew swiftly down the stairs and encountered the colonel in the hall. Here she poured into his astonished ear a voluble and exaggerated statement of her discovery, and indignant recital of her wrongs. "Don't tell me the whole thing wasn't arranged beforehand, for I know it was," she almost screamed. "And think," she added, "of the heartlessness of the wretch, leaving his own child alone here in that way." "Well, it's a blank shame," stammered the colonel, without the least idea of what he was talking about. In fact, utterly unable as he was to comprehend a reason for the woman's excitement with his estimate of her character, I fear he showed it more plainly than he intended. He stammered, expanded his chest, looked stern, gallant, tender, but all unintelligently. Mrs. Tretherick for an instant experienced a sickening doubt of the existence of natures in perfect affinity. "It's of no use," said Mrs. Tretherick with sudden vehemence, in answer to some inaudible remark of the colonel's, and withdrawing her hand from the fevered grasp of that ardent and sympathetic man. "It's of no use. My mind is made up. You can send for my trunk as soon as you like, but I shall stay here and confront that man with the proof of his vileness. I will put him face to face with his infamy." I do not know whether Colonel Starbottle thoroughly appreciated the convincing proof of Tretherick's unfaithfulness and malignity afforded by the damning evidence of the existence of Tretherick's own child in his own house. He was dimly aware, however, of some unforeseen obstacle to the perfect expression of the infinite longing of his own sentimental nature. But before he could say anything, Carrie appeared on the landing above them, looking timidly and yet half critically at the pair. "That's her!" said Mrs. Tretherick excitedly. In her deepest emotions, in either verse or prose, she rose above a consideration of grammatical construction. "Oh," said the colonel, with a sudden assumption of paternal affection and jocularity that was glaringly unreal and affected. "Oh, pretty little girl, how do you do? How are you? Well, you find yourself pretty well, do you, pretty little girl?" The colonel's impulse was also to expand his chest and swing his cane until it occurred to him that this action might be ineffective with a child of 6 or 7. Carrie, however, took no immediate notice of this advance, but further discomposed the chivalrous colonel by running quickly to Mrs. Tretherick and hiding herself, as if for protection, in the folds of her gown. Nevertheless, the colonel was not vanquished. Falling back into an attitude of respectful admiration, he pointed out a marvelous resemblance to the Madonna and Child. Mrs. Tretherick simpered, but did not dislodge Carrie as before. There was an awkward pause for a moment, and then Mrs. Tretherick, motioning significantly to the child, said in a whisper, "Go now. Don't come here again, but meet me tonight at the hotel." She extended her hand. The colonel bent over it gallantly, and raising his hat, the next moment was gone. "Well, do you think," said Mrs. Tretherick with an embarrassed voice and a prodigious blush, looking down and addressing the fiery curls just visible in the folds of her dress, "do you think you'll be good if I let you stay in here and sit with me?" "And let me call you Mama?" queried Carrie, looking up. "And let you call me Mama," assented Mrs. Tretherick with an embarrassed laugh. "Yes," said Carrie promptly. They entered the bedroom together. Carrie's eye instantly caught sight of the trunk. "Are you doing away again, Mama?" she said with a quick, nervous look, and clutch at the woman's dress. "No," said Mrs. Tretherick, looking out the window. "Only playing you're doing away," suggested Carrie with a laugh. "Let me play too." Mrs. Tretherick assented. Carrie flew into the next room, and presently reappeared dragging a small trunk, into which she gravely proceeded to pack her clothes. Mrs. Tretherick noticed that they were not many. A question or two regarding them brought out some further replies from the child, and before many minutes had elapsed, Mrs. Tretherick was in possession of all her earlier history. But to do this, Mrs. Tretherick had been obliged to take Carrie upon her lap, pending the most confidential disclosures. They sat thus a long time after Mrs. Tretherick had apparently ceased to be interested in Carrie's disclosures, and when lost in thought, she allowed the child to rattle on unheeded, and ran her fingers through the scarlet curls. "You don't hold me right, Mama," said Carrie at last, after one or two uneasy shiftings of position. "Well, how should I hold you?" asked Mrs. Tretherick with a half-amused, half-embarrassed laugh. "This way," said Carrie, curling up into position with one arm around Mrs. Tretherick's neck and her cheek resting on her bosom. "This way, dear." After a little preparatory nestling, not unlike some small animal, she closed her eyes and went to sleep. For a few moments the woman sat silent, scarcely daring to breathe in that artificial attitude, and then, whether from some occult sympathy in the touch, or God best knows what, a sudden fancy began to thrill her. She began by remembering an old pain that she had forgotten, an old horror that she had resolutely put away all these years. She recalled days of sickness and distrust, days of an overshadowing fear, days of preparation for something that was to be prevented, that was prevented, with mortal agony and fear. She thought of a life that might have been. She dared not say had been, and wondered. It was 6 years ago. If it had lived, it would have been as old as Carrie. The arms which were folded loosely around the sleeping child began to tremble and tighten their clasp. And then the deep potential impulse came, and with a half-sob, half-sigh, she threw her arms out and drew the body of the sleeping child down, down, into her breast, down again and again as if she would hide it in the grave dug there years before. And the gust that shook her passed, and then, ah me, the rain. A drop or two fell upon the curls of Carrie, and she moved uneasily in her sleep. But the woman soothed her again. It was so easy to do it now. And they sat there quiet and undisturbed, so quiet that they might have seemed incorporate of the lonely, silent house, the slowly declining sunbeams, and the general air of desertion and abandonment, yet a desertion that had in it nothing of age, decay, or despair. Colonel Starbottle waited at the Fiddletown Hotel all that night in vain, and the next morning, when Mr. Tretherick returned to his husks, he found the house vacant and untenanted, except by motes and sunbeams.